Hey, everybody, before we begin this next episode of the Working Genius podcast, we want to remind you about a special promotional discount we're doing. Cody, tell them about it.
Yeah, Pat, last episode you said, let's do a pre-Christmas sale, and that's exactly what we're doing. So you have until November 27th to get 20% off the Working Genius. Type in pre-Christmas, all caps, as you're checking out, and you'll get 20% off. And we're zigging while the rest of the world is zagging, Pat, because this sale ends on midnight on Thanksgiving and goes to full price on Black Friday. So take advantage of it while you can.
All righty, let's get started with the episode. Cue the music. Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by the full crew of Cody, Tracy, and Beau. How you all doing?
Wonderful.
Great.
Great and wonderful. That's good. Karen's here writing notes to me so I don't miss anything. And Matt's in studio, keeping all this moving forward. Cody, what is our topic today?
Your first hire.
That's right. Your first hire. We're thinking about this. Imagine that you're starting a business and you got to hire somebody, or you already have a business and a bunch of people started it like we did. And then what are you missing? What is the first person? We were thinking about calling this the other. Who is your other? Because when you start a business, whether you're doing it on your own or with a group of other people, there's that thing that's missing that if you don't have it, that complement to who you are, you're just not going to be able to achieve what you want to achieve as well as you could, but it depends on a lot of factors. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's not just a matter of finding somebody who has the things you don't have. And it's not usually finding somebody who's exactly like you. It's just understanding all the factors that go into figuring out who you need to hire first. So let's just jump into that.
I'll jump right in, Pat. I'm excited to have this conversation because it does something that we've talked about many times on this podcast, is it changes the way that we think about job descriptions, right? Like, because typically if you say, hey, who's your first hire? People go, well, you need a COO, or who's going to be another executive team member. And it's like, that is, especially when you're talking about just getting a business off the ground, so much less important than understanding your own geniuses, your own frustrations, and then who you need around you to help you succeed. And that gives so much more. I actually had this very conversation. Somebody said, hey, will you help write a job description for me, or tell me a few key things that a COO would do, which I'd be terrible at, first of all, writing that job description. But I was like, I actually care way more about what your geniuses are and then what you think your business needs. And that was a way more fruitful conversation than what does the job description look like and what's the title.
Right. Exactly. And I have more to say about that. But Beau, you were going to say something. What was that?
Well, you started this business, and I'd love to hear you think about, in the rearview mirror, how did you do this, or how would you have done it differently if you had this tool?
Right. So I'll do that real fast, because I remember when I did start, I told my dad, God rest his soul, that I'm going to go do my own business. And he was like, but you had benefits at your old company. You came from the old world where you wanted stability and all of that. And I said, I know, but I really want to do this. And I said, and I'm bringing 4 people with me. And he goes, oh, don't do that. You might not be able to afford to pay them. Wait till you make money. And then when you can afford them, hire them. I said, well, I'll never make any money if I don't hire them now, because they're good at things I'm not good at. And I didn't know what the working genius was. And by the grace of God, we got it right in many ways. I hired people that were good at things I wasn't. But if Tracy and I could go back and hire one other person to help us, knowing what our working geniuses were 27 years ago, Tracy, we would have ideally, regardless of their skill set, in terms of regardless of whether they were in sales or consulting or whatever else, we would have liked to have somebody on the team who was what?
I think we both had the same answer. We both said GT.
Galvanizing and tenacity. Yeah,
that's right.
Interesting.
And if we think about it, back then, we didn't know this, and it was a blessing because that's how we came up with this model. We didn't have a galvanizer, and I was the closest thing to a galvanizer. So for 20 years, 19 until we hired Cody, but then that took us a while to figure out too, we didn't have any G, and it kind of drove me crazy. The other thing is, I assumed Tracy was the one that liked to finish things and do all this. So she did that for 20 years, and I was burning her out. And so if we had had somebody on the team that was a G and a T, it would have allowed Tracy and I not to get burned out.
Yeah. And I think in our case, we needed to fill the gaps. We had pretty big gaps there.
Right.
And I think if we led with filling those gaps, that would have saved us a lot of pain and burnout.
So our first hire would have been a GT, regardless of whether it was our assistant or whatever else. We'd have probably said, we're missing that. Now, we'd have tried to hire somebody in the right role, of course, but it was really the working genius that mattered the most.
And I'll just say it's worth reminding people. So Pat, you're an inventor discerner, right? So you have the ideation phase sort of covered with the invention. And then Tracy is a discerner and enabler. So she had like a little bit of the, you guys had activation as it relates to discernment with the gap of galvanizing, and then a little bit of enablement that looked enough like tenacity that you got some stuff done. And I love that you said that, Pat. Like, it's kind of glad, man, if you had accidentally hired a galvanizer tenacity person, you might not have gotten the grumpies at work, and we might not have working genius. It's fun to think of it that way. But
absolutely, we're not complaining.
Yeah, in retrospect too, it's great to go, oh, here's what worked really well about that combination is Pat got to invent and discern, and Tracy and Karen, who both are discerner enabler types, got to discern that invention and then help move it along. Like the Table Group very much is a content ideation company, and you guys got to bring that to life. And it wasn't certainly, you guys were never in danger of it being like an execution company. Like you guys did a lot of the invention and got to discern and make really good content that the world needed.
And it's worth saying this because we got to be more grateful than regretful, because there's no regrets there. But the other people that they have discernment, and we needed that because we were kind of a think tank and did like, what's the right thing to do? And we didn't really have experience in this area, but we had good gut feel about what was the right kind of client and how should we go about doing this. So we have far, far more to be thankful for. But looking back, and people that are listening to this, that maybe they've just taken on a job, and you have to look at your own working genius and say, what do I need somebody to balance me or to complement me or to fill in the gaps? But it's not always your opposite. That's, I think, what's interesting to talk about. Sometimes you need somebody who shares one of your geniuses. And could one of you guys explain why sometimes it's good to have somebody that has an overlapping genius?
Well, I'll jump in with my own story, which is we've partnered with a company called Belay, which is a virtual assistant company, and they're great. And they got how working genius works into the placement. And this is pretty much right in line with the conversation that we're having, is they realize that, hey, we're trying to place virtual assistants with people who are entrepreneurs or solopreneurs or leaders. And one of the things they're solving for is, hey, what's painful to you that you want to outsource to somebody else? And so in the conversations, as they're using Working Genius to do this work, I got to be able to say, I'm a discerner galvanizer, but I have very little enablement and tenacity. And as a result, things are really hard for me to, and in the Myers-Briggs, I'm not even a J. I don't have judgment in the Myers-Briggs, not trying to throw too many models in here, but the judging preference of where you're finishing things.
Yeah, finishing things and tying up loose ends is not your thing.
Right. And so they were like, hey, what would be an ideal fit for you? And here was sort of the way I got to answer that question was, I really do need some tenacity, or at least enablement or tenacity. And it would be really helpful for me if that person also had discernment, because I don't want to have to discern everything that goes on my calendar, but I would certainly love someone to finish that and be able to make some judgment calls. And so they paired me with this person who's a DE, and it's been fantastic. So they using that. So that's an example of where like doubling up on a genius, like Tracy had discernment and you had discernment when you started the company, still really valuable, but knowing where your gaps are and what you need beyond that is really important.
Okay, I'll just make one comment. It wasn't as simple as what are your frustrations. It was what's the problem that they need to solve? What is the gap that they need to fill? And then a little bit like where are you just going to naturally be in sync, right? Like that where I think the discernment and tenacity is really, really good for you of let them swim in the pool that you love swimming in, discernment, and then fill in the biggest gap. You didn't need from this assistant very much in the world of enablement, right? You needed much more like get things across the finish line for me. So sorry, Pat, go ahead.
Oh, and you know what else is something interesting, Cody? We just did a little reorg here. And again, it's not about job titles. That's what I want to talk about here. It's not about job titles. It's like, what do you really need? Because we just moved Julie in our organization over to your part of the business. She's a DT. So she discerns with you, which is good, but then she gets it done. So between you and your DE assistant and you and Julie, who's like your right-hand person, the DT, you've got it covered. And too often people will say, we need to make our first hire in our business or a hire. And they think we need a salesperson or we need an office assistant or something like that. And so we look for people who have experience in that field. But one salesperson is not the same as another salesperson. One administrative or office assistant is not the same as another. Spend less time focusing on the job title and their experience versus what working geniuses you need. And then you can help make that person work and they're going to love their job.
And what's implied in this that is so valuable to think of if you're starting your own business or making your first hire is the thing like Pat, like your thing, we want you to use the thing that you're best at. And so it's more about like, it's not just, oh, I have a gap over here. It's like, I want to do the thing that I'm best at. For you, it's invention. If you had hired another inventor right out of the gate, it's sort of like doubling up on something that you don't quite need yet. So the idea of saying, let's base it on where there's some needs around the things that I don't do well is a way better recipe for success than sort of blindly writing a job description and maybe hiring somebody with your same geniuses.
That's a really good point, because the thing is, if you're the leader, then you're going to feel responsible for filling in the gaps. And if I had hired another inventor right out of the gates, I would have probably felt responsible for enabling them to invent. And I'd have gone and done the things that nobody else was doing. And even more so, that would have taken me out of my thing. So what's interesting, it's like hire people that you need that do things that you're not good at. But sometimes they can share a genius. But if it's your favorite thing to do and it's going to make you less likely to spend time in that area, it could be the worst thing you ever do. I wish there was a predictable way to say this, because the best answer in the world is almost usually, it depends.
Yep.
But in this case, ask yourself, I like what they did at Belay. What's your pain and how can somebody help you with that? And that's going to be a combination of overlap with your genius and filling in gaps.
It also feels worth just reminding this statement that we've said so many times is, the best leader is the self-aware leader. The best entrepreneur is the self-aware entrepreneur. The best hiring manager is the self-aware. Like, if you really know who you are, you're going to be better equipped to be able to make that first hire. And I think that in addition to we hire COOs and office managers who've done that job before, I think is the other problem is leaders don't pause to say, who am I really? What are my frustrations really? How do I advertise those really openly as I'm hiring somebody so that they can hit the ground running?
It's funny, we're talking about this as your first hire, right? But really, this is about hiring anybody. It's like you need someone to fill gaps or to address pain. And this is why I believe this assessment will become a standard in the world of staffing. I don't think there's a lawyer in the world who would be able to I don't know if that they'd even want to make an argument you shouldn't be able to use this assessment, because it's absolutely not discriminatory. It's actually helping people avoid taking a job that they would hate. And it's helping companies avoiding hiring somebody that they're not going to like. This is so much about finding good fit that it seems to me like every staffing company in the world and every company in the world would say, let's use Working Genius to make sure that we don't cause more pain for ourselves and others. So it's particularly important on your first hire, but boy, if it's even your most recent hire, this to me is a better understanding of who you're looking for.
This conversation has been one of the more fun ones I get to have recently. I've had many friends since Working Genius come out and say, hey, I'm going to go out on my own, maybe as a coach, or hey, I'm going to start this business. What advice do you have for me? And what I love being able to do with Working Genius is say, hey, let's find out what your Working Genius is. And that will give us a pretty good idea of where you're going to get stuck or lost or bored or burned out. And if you don't solve that problem relatively quickly, it's going to be bad for you and the success of whatever endeavor you're trying to do. So the idea of like just knowing that for yourself and then applying it to the first hire, second hire, third hire. I think the recipe for success around entrepreneurship and leading a new initiative, I mean, I think Working Genius could dramatically improve the success rate if you use it in this way.
I agree, Cody. And Karen just wrote me a note, and that's that it depends on where you are and what stage of your company, how to use this. And I think early stage, I'm going to contradict myself now. I think early stage is so much more important because in the early stages, you have fewer people. And so filling that gap is going to allow you to get where you need to get. But having said all of that, and especially in early stage, even more than Working Genius, it's important, it's critical that we hire for core values. Because like in the early days of our company, if we had found a GT, but not one that fit our core values, it would have been a victory in a battle and losing the war. So as much as I love Working Genius, hiring for values fit is so much more important. It should be the second stage after you get the right people on the bus that you find the right seat for them, and that's Working Genius.
Interesting. Do you think in early stages, people are more tempted to hire people like them, especially the solopreneurs out there? Do you think they're tempted to find like-minded people?
You know, that's a great question. And you know what's funny is we tend to go, don't hire like-minded people. But I would say hire like-minded people when it comes to values. Don't hire like-minded people when it comes to skills. I mean, they're completely different. And I was doing a talk to a bunch of CEOs recently. They said, what about diversity? And I said, you want diversity around skill sets and all these other things. But around the one or two core values in your organization, diversity is actually a bad thing because it means you're not going to have a culture. But so I think that if somebody goes, I like to invent things, I'm going to hire a bunch of people who like to invent things, really dangerous. But this is what I value in how people work and how they work together. I think hiring people that have a similar view is, so one's a distinct advantage and one is a distinct disadvantage. It's a great question.
Okay, Pat, this conversation reminds me of a movie I just watched, and Tracy and Beau are going to roll their eyes because I've already used this movie in like 5 analogies in the last week. But it's the movie BlackBerry, about the rise and fall of the BlackBerry phone. And I think you watched it too, right?
I saw it too. It was fascinating.
And what was so fascinating, which you know, there's a lot of things that were interesting about that story, but one of them is these two sort of nerdy, like intellectual characters who basically discover a way of making a BlackBerry an email terminal. That was the big thing, right? Is like you could do text message calls and email on the same thing
before smartphones.
And I was sort of, while I was watching, I was thinking of it through the lens of Working Genius in some way, because these two highly intelligent guys who probably both have invention, and one of them probably had discernment, and they figured out the right thing, and they have this great scene at the very beginning where they're doing a sales pitch to this executive at a phone service company. And so they're trying to sell them on the pitch. Well, they have absolutely zero or negative galvanizing. They were so bad at the pitch. And this guy ends up, I don't want to ruin the story, but he sees the tool that they've built, and he knows he can sell. And so he goes and works with them. And that's what causes them to have the success that they had, is that, but imagine that, like, so many entrepreneurs and people have this idea, and the idea is great, but it takes all 6 geniuses. We always talk about, it's like, hey, it takes all 6 of these to launch a new initiative. And then we go back and think, oh, we'll just do this from the purity of the idea. No, it requires all these things.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. I'd forgotten about that movie, Cody, because I think the guys that invented it were probably WIs. They were classic. You know why? Because they never even were getting close to finishing, but they had great ideas, beautiful ideas, but they were happy just coming up with this crazy idea and then playing video games with their friends. And then the guy came along who was probably a GT and kind of an ass. And I mean, and the way they portrayed him, I'm not saying the real guy was. And he was like, hey, you guys, you have no idea what to do with this. I'm going to finish this for you.
Yeah.
And he did. And that's how it got off the ground. It really was a story about adding other working geniuses to make a company work. But now then it goes off into why they went off the rails and all that other stuff. But it's a pretty interesting movie. And that's a great example. Beau?
It would be really interesting if on Shark Tank, if we knew the genius pairings of each of the sharks and the geniuses of the people pitching a product, Because if you hear the Shark Tank pitch, sometimes they're saying so loud and clear, I need a galvanizer. Can you help me get in Costco? Can you help me get you wherever? But sometimes, how great would it be if they were like, we just really need discernment. We have all these ideas and we're not sure what we need to do next. And somebody who's listening to this, can you just send this to Mark Cuban and help them get Working Genius in Shark Tank? But I think that it would really help people who are starting businesses be able to know, who should I be looking for in a partner?
Right. Mark Cuban, by the way, is a fan of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. He used it in his businesses and other things. And when the Mavericks won the championship that day, he actually tweeted to a friend of mine about the 5 dysfunctions. But what I want to say here is, and I think it would be easier to pick which of the people to give money to, and it would allow those people to decide, I don't think these partners or these people that are running this company, I think they're missing some things. Before I invest in them, they'd have to make another hire. So I kind of wish we had started talking about it like that. Shark Tank and Working Genius. But we got there. So that's great. There. All right. We want to thank everybody for listening. We love that there are so many people getting certified and using this and taking this to every part of the world. And we really appreciate that. So thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you next time on the Working Genius podcast. God bless.